everybody. If you're just joining us, this is our second session, Nonprofit Nuts and Bolts. I'm Dave Moss, and with me today, Chandler Arnold and Ashley Lahoud. Ashley is a board member in Fundraising. Chandler has been an evaluator for a while. If he's ever evaluated one of your proposals, you know he writes like a decent amount. There's lots of things. The nonprofit sector is big. It's a lot of people who are like public sector employees. Our last session was about who deserves public support. We panelists here, all of us have worked at a variety of different nonprofits. I've mostly worked at smaller ones. Ashley and Chandler have some experience working at what I would call bigger nonprofits. And we've had a bunch of conversations over the last few weeks to plan for this conversation, and it was clear that there's there's a lot to talk about. We tried to synthesize it, and we have two convenient lists. Right, we're going to talk about the 5 challenges. We narrowed it down to 5 day-to-day challenges that we feel all day-to-day nonprofit employees are dealing with. Whether you're considering going to work at a nonprofit or fund a nonprofit, we think it would behoove you to be aware of these challenges. You're going to have to deal with them. You probably won't be the special exemption that gets to avoid these 5 things. You're probably going to have to spend a decent amount of time on them. And perhaps some of them, the philanthropy sector can improve for us. And some of them, folks in nonprofits can improve themselves. Still other things I think might require government intervention, perhaps even divine intervention, to see significant movement on. Anyway, this is talk about, and we are going to dive into it. Let's see the next slide, please, David. So these are the 5 challenges. We'll leave them up there for folks to think about a little bit as our panelists introduce themselves. I will let Ashley go first.
All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming out today. Very much looking forward to this conversation. As Dave said, I'm Ashley Lahoud. I've been a board member of the Unfunded list for over 5 years, and I've been in the nonprofit sector in a variety of roles for over 20. Right now, I'm the Director of Development at Northside Center for Child Development. We're a historic organization in New York. We provide early childhood, mental health, and services to children and families. And in that role, and in the other roles that I've had, I think I've seen lots and lots of different iterations of these 5 challenges and how they can present themselves and how we can deal with it. So really looking forward to getting into that with you and working on solutions.
Chandler, please.
Sure. My name's Chandler Arnold. Excited to be here today. I started my nonprofit career about 25 years ago, founding a small community-based organization working with low-income preschoolers in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So got a lot of grassroots community-based experience there. And then over the past years, I've served as a CEO, a COO, and a board member for a couple of national organizations, including serving as COO of First Book, a group that's given about, while I was there, we gave away 165 million new books to kids from low-income families. So also serve as a board member now for Every Child a Reader. So bring a variety of perspectives from the nonprofit space, and excited to chat and learn what you're thinking about as well.
All right, terrific. So we are going to start with this first one, which we talked about a little bit in the last session. And in that session, I mentioned some statistics from our friends at the Urban Center. I think I have a link to that. But the majority of executive directors at nonprofits are planning to leave their jobs. And about 60% of them feel burned out or used up. Some of the reasons why they feel that way are come after burnout on the list here. Right, we'll start in very direct. And Ashley, have you ever felt burnt out in your job?
Yeah, many times. And I have many times at different times in my career. I think that it's been for varying reasons. Sometimes because I felt unappreciated, and I think that that was probably a worse kind of burnout than the times when I've been overworked or understaffed. I think that was probably pretty significant. Also, times when I felt that I didn't have a lot of control over, making any choices about my job or workflow and things like that. For me, that was the worst kind of burnout. But having said that, I think that right now we're seeing definitely the worst retention and burnout industry wide that I've ever seen. And you're absolutely right about a lot of executive directors wanting, planning to step down. But this is the first time that I've seen very few people want to take those executive director positions once they become available. Maybe it's just my focus here, but in the past, I knew a lot more people who were interested in assuming that role and kind of waiting for the baby boomers to retire. And now it seems that people really aren't that interested.
Yeah, it does. It never seemed like something I wanted to do. I deliberately don't call myself that, although I do a lot of the job function. And I'll say one of the reasons why I don't want to is because a lot of the executive people who I've met who have been executive directors for a long time seem burned out to me. Right. So I didn't necessarily want to do it. And you hit on something that, is really important to me. I think the common perception and the easy way to describe it, right, is like more vacations, time off. Don't make them work late. Right. But I mean, when I started, I wanted to do all those things. I really wanted to get to work, right, and solve problems, right. It was like lack of appreciation and those other things that are much more of the problem. And I think when you do have that support, right, some nonprofits do, you probably see the less of it. So in some ways, like, it's pretty clear how this issue would get solved, right? It's just to sort of fund these positions more, provide these things more. Appreciation can help. There's a lot of toxic environments that you run right out of, for sure.
Yeah.
I think First Book is a sterling, stalwart organization. Right? We've had some other evaluators involved in the organization. It's pretty big. There's a decent amount of resources. Like, for instance, when I remember when you were telling me about how your team managed to handle compliance. Right? My first thought was like, yes, it would be cool if you had a team. Like, I had a team to help me with compliance. No problem. Right? So I'm always interested to hear from people who've been at big outfits that are having like massive impact, which is also point number 5 here. What did you think about burnout and staff retention there? The big place.
I think it's a great question because I sort of think about it on 2 levels. One, burnout for the executive team, which Ashley, and the leadership team, which Ashley talked about, and I could definitely say more about. And then also retention and burnout vis-a-vis the staff that those executives are managing. In larger organizations, those core staff members really are doing the work of the organization. And I think that burnout is very, very real at that level. Also, a lot of times you have young, idealistic people who on one hand get tremendous satisfaction and wrap their identity up very much with the work that they are doing, and that is tremendous. But on the other hand, burnout is very real, and let's be honest, data also tells us that burnout sometimes disproportionately affects women, people of color, members of the queer community, folks who might be juggling a variety of challenges that other people might not even be thinking of. So one, I think it's very real, and to have candid conversations about it is the first step. I think 2, for the executive team members who might be listening or folks that are thinking about those roles, understanding that you're not alone. When I was in that role, there were a lot of things that I couldn't talk about with staff members that I was wrestling with. You don't want to go into your junior team member and complain about a board member or a funder or some other challenge necessarily. So I created my own support network outside of the organization, which was tremendously helpful for me. We also were lucky enough to have some funders that were investing in that sort of executive development. But I think for the team members that you're managing, it's really important for them. I think the hopelessness point that you all raise is very real. I think it's not the folks that we worked with, they weren't scared of a ton of work. They weren't scared of working really hard. The problem came if they didn't feel appreciated, if they didn't understand where the organization was going, if they didn't understand how the work that they were doing day to day was directly advancing the mission, and if they didn't feel like they had their own personal development pathway within the organization. So sitting down to understand what individual team members' goals are, how they can work within the organization to develop new skills so that they can progress in their own careers. I think these are really important conversations, not only for employee retention and happiness and productivity, but for the mission work that the organization is doing.
That does all sound quite nice. I wish I'd had the opportunity to work. Maybe someday I'll get to work for you somewhere. See what all of that is like. I was talking about in an earlier session about, there's a quote from The Wire. I want to know what it's like to work in a real police department. I find myself thinking the same thing about some of the nonprofits I worked at. I very clearly see the opportunity to make some impact. If only I could have just a little bit of resources, please. Which brings me to my next point, right? Lots of times I actually understood why my boss was saying no to those resources, because we didn't have them. Pretty simple. We can't spend the money on that because we don't have the card would get declined if we tried to buy that. Obviously, right? Get good at fundraising is one way to address this. But in general, you're always going to need more funding. Tough challenge to talk about, right? But Ashley, you raise money all day for your job, day to day.
So what do I have to say about that? There's so much there. I mean, there's so many challenges right now and so many things that I would suggest to address it. And I know that we have some very specific suggestions relative to fundraising a little bit further in the presentation, so I'll wait on that. I would say that the biggest challenge is the board or executive directors who don't understand how fundraising works and therefore are unrealistic about it. Luckily, I'm not facing that right now, but in my current position, that is not a problem. But there have been so many places where I've worked where it's just like, well, we need $500,000, make it happen. And if there's no prospects, nobody there who can do it, oh, we'll find another foundation that'll fund us. Why don't you check in Pennsylvania? Well, they're not interested in funding New York. Oh, I don't care to try. How could they no to us? And having to spend so much time educating the board. I had one more person say, have you thought about asking Oprah? Have you thought about going to Bill Gates? How about Jeff Bezos? I think it's the unrealistic
conversation. Like, why Bill? Like, they can't just ask Oprah for money,
right? So I think that's been. I think that's probably the biggest misunderstanding that makes development potentially extremely stressful and very much prone to burnout, because it's fundamentally unfair and it's impossible if that's what you're dealing with. So what I would say is that the best thing, if you're facing that kind of persistent lack of resources, I would say that the best defense is a good offense, I guess, as they say. If you're interviewing for any kind of development job or any job where there's a fundraising expectation, find out ahead of time what this expectation is. As Elizabeth said, lack of strategy is exhausting, especially in development. Right, find out ahead of time. How do you expect me to do this? What are your prospects? Are you expecting me to just magically come up with this? And I think that getting that kind of clear expectation as early as possible will make your life a lot easier as a fundraiser. Or make it easier to say no and to find another job, because there are also plenty of places that would be more reasonable or that you could, bring along to reality. It's not worth.
What are some what are some good some I think we could have a very long conversation about like red flags in fundraising positions. I've seen a
Sure.
lot. You see a lot of stuff, and I've gone to interviews for things where like they want some particularly like we're looking to hire a part-time development contractor or something like that is always a bad like that. What that means is they have like $5,000 total, right? They say you'll need to do all the fundraising for them in exchange for like whatever it is. They have a little bit saved up, right? And they know they need fundraising help, and now they've posted a job ad, right? Those I responded to enough of them that I can recognize them now. But what is a good development director? Because there's a lot of groups trying to hire both executive directors and, as you mentioned earlier, right, and fundraising directors. What are the good ones going to say?
Wait, what are the good?
Yeah,
I didn't hear the whole.
If
like, what you mean a good employer?
Oh,
okay, go ahead.
The green lights, not the red flags. What are the green?
The green lights, like in the interviewing process. Sure. A board that understands fundraising. So a board that understands that in a lot of ways, fundraising is one of their primary responsibilities, and that ties fundraising success to board involvement. I would say an organization where, this one's tricky, but where the program staff are at least somewhat in agreement about fundraising, where they understand that they're going to have to help with the proposal process, because that's helpful. Because then when you are applying for grants and then hopefully getting the grants and reporting on them, you want to make sure that the outcomes are reasonable to the program staff. So there has to be really good communication about that. Finance department that understands fundraising and that understands that in the budgeting process, whatever the expectation is for development has to be something that's based in reality, ideally coming from the development department, those projections. And that doesn't just, again, kind of similar to the nightmare scenario, doesn't just expect you to solve the deficit every year. And I think really making sure that if the board gets it, then the rest of the organization should fall in line. I think those would be green lights relative to development expectations. And also, I would say a board and an executive director that are sophisticated and realistic enough to understand that even with some of the closest donor relationships or closest foundation relationships, like all relationships end. So, you can't expect the same foundation to fund you for 10, 15 years. If it does, you're very lucky, but you always have to have a contingency plan. At some point that funding will run its course.
Very good. Always a pleasure listening to you talk about the profession. I think everybody should listen to all of that. Lack of resources is a very common topic here for Unfunded List. We're going to move on to something that I don't think I've ever actually talked about on a panel, but I have done it a lot of my jobs. Donation processing. In fact, the very first job in DC.
Dave, could I add one?
Chandler, please.
Could I just, Ashley, I was taking notes as you talked. I think that is so true. And I won't even add anything to that from the development side. The work that I do now is about sort of reimagining what that relationship between funder and organization can be. But I also wanted to just double click on another facet for those of you that are running organizations or those of you that are funding organizations. The persistent lack of resources also has a dramatic effect on employee morale and strategic thinking. And I think that, I was lucky enough to do CSR stuff at big groups like Coca-Cola and BCG with large budgets. I never had that same experience in a nonprofit, even very, very large nonprofits. And I think that constant scarcity of resources has all kinds of ramifications, even in terms of way employees view the world and what is possible. And so one thing that I just want to highlight for executive directors and those working with executive directors and those making, to Elizabeth's points, strategic decisions, there is a real power in saying no from an organizational standpoint. All of these nonprofits, most of them, there are too many things for them to do each day, and there are too many things for each staff member on their to-do list. There is a real power in saying, look, our main goal is XYZ, and A, B, C, and D are not as relevant to that main goal as these other things. And so we are going to stop doing A, B, C, and D. And I think that that is something that so many teams that I worked with never realized was possible, because it was just always the way that things had been done. We always, I don't know, create this monthly newsletter that no one reads. Well, my goodness, what if we didn't send that newsletter out? And what if we used that staff time for other items
Right.
that were more critical? And so we would do an exercise sometimes where we'd ask every staff member in their annual reviews to tell us the 3 things that they did that they thought were the most productive and impactful to the mission, and the 3 things that they did that they thought were the biggest waste of time. Now, some of those waste of time
Mm.
things have to happen for other reasons, but it was really illuminating. And I would just encourage all of you to embrace the freedom that comes with liberating yourself from some of those tertiary goals as a way to focus on what's most important.
Thank you.
That's a good point. Very good point.
And speaking of waste of time, donation processing, acknowledgement. So I've had a few jobs in my career where I did up to 100% of my time spent after the gift was made, putting paperwork in folders, making copies. The most interesting, writing thank you letters, I enjoy. I used to have to write the copy for the thank you letters, right? Sending out large batches of thank you letters, making sure that the envelopes all match everything, and keeping all the records. I was never at a place as big as either of you. So, and a real purpose here, right, is especially for folks who might not understand like the day-to-day work of a nonprofit fundraiser, right? Chandler, talk to me a little bit, and we'll stay with you for a little bit, about processing donations at a place that receives a lot of donations every day.
This is Coca-Cola, not vodka, because it is I think that folks dramatically underestimate the time that goes into that process. We once did a process map for our donations, and it was something like 27 steps that the development team had to go through for each gift that came in the door. And these weren't unnecessary steps. There's so many detail. There's nothing worse than a donor getting a letter, as you mentioned, Dave, with the wrong name or the wrong amount. There's sort of 1,000 things that can go wrong. And one thing that I would urge board members and executive directors to remember, that when there is a mistake, like, it's okay to focus on the mistake, but also remember the thousands of others that went out without any errors. Like, it's one of those things that, like, you never get celebrated for the things that go right. You only get in trouble for the occasional thing that goes wrong. And I'm not dismissing that, but
No, they would bring me into the office only if I made a mistake.
And that's not a happy environment for an employee. So whenever mistakes would happen, and they did happen, we would try to frame it as, okay, let's use this as an opportunity to do a root cause analysis and understand what went wrong, and not just fix it for this one donor, but let's fix our process so that this doesn't happen again. So that's one thing that I really, because in the day-to-day, when you're moving so quickly, there can be an urgency to just fix that one thing instead of taking the time to fix the process to prevent that one thing from ever happening again. So we kind of got to the point where, like, oh, I'm happy because we found a new mistake in our process, but now we can fix that process. So I think that's one thing. And I think the other is, there was a time when a letter went to a major donor with a major error in the letter, and that's a bad thing. If mistakes happen, don't try to cover them up. Don't try to sugarcoat it. I would pick up the phone and call that person and say, ideally before they get the letter, but perhaps after they get the letter, and say, hey, look, I am so sorry. Here's the mistake that happened. Here's how we fixed our core process. And here's why your donation is so important to us. 9 times out of 10, that conversation can actually make the donor love you more because they understand how seriously you take it and how you've worked to fix it. The groups that I've seen that ignore that, or God forbid, try to blame it on the junior development officer that might have made the mistake. My goodness, don't do that. Own the mistakes, do a root cause analysis, and be candid about what you've learned from that process.
Well, yeah, we do in the proposals we review. Oftentimes, evaluators will check like you got so a really common mistake I see pretty much every round. The name of a different foundation in the text, right? Because they've copied text from a previous grant proposal. A very common practice. But they've written like, we're requesting this money from the Ashley Foundation, right? And this is a letter that's to the Chandler Foundation. It's happened to me when I've been on some funding committees too. And yeah, if they reach out and say, hey, listen, we realized that we kept this mistake after it happened. That's actually one, it makes you easier to remember, if anything. And it actually highlights the need for support. I mean, you need resources. That's why, like, if you had 1,000 people working there, you wouldn't make these little tiny mistakes. And honestly, even big organizations like Coca-Cola send me emails that say, "Dear Dan," or whatever. Ashley, you, God willing, you receive donations and you acknowledge them. Right?
Absolutely. So just relative to the processing and acknowledgement challenges, frankly.
Sorry, one thing you mentioned earlier that I wanted to hear more from you about was that it is important. Like, we're talking about it as a challenge, but acknowledgement is an important part of the process. Right? You've got to do this, not just because like you have to do it, right? Right. But yeah, fundamentally, we want to hear about your day-to-day processing donations and acknowledging them. What's that like?
Oh, okay. So that's kind of something that, to be honest, I need to streamline a little bit right now. It's not exactly how I would want it to be. But the donations are processed by somebody on my team. We use Razor's Edge. And then there's a lot of liaising with our finance department on that processing process. And we're looking at ways to make it more efficient. I don't know if we're at 27 steps. Some days it feels like 127. So we're trying to take a closer look at that and see ways to spend less time. And then on the acknowledgement side, it's the same thing. I have other people who do the letters at this point, but I do take a close look at them. I try to make them very personalized. I think it's important. People like to hear a story about how their gift has made an impact. So I try to connect it to that, and that seems to work very well. And also, sometimes, I do have a small team and a lot of gifts coming in. Sometimes it is difficult to get the thank you letters out in a timely fashion. I strive to block out time on my calendar, usually on Fridays, where I have the phone numbers of everybody who's given over the past week or so, and I call them up. And that always goes well. Everybody loves a thank you call. I can kind of hear them waiting on the other end of the phone, like they're thinking I'm going to ask them for another donation. And they seem relieved when I'm calling just to thank them. Yep. But that, I think, is much more effective, frankly, than the letters. We treat the letter, I try to treat the letter almost more as an IRS, sort of thing. It's for bookkeeping. The real acknowledgement is when I call or when I have a board member call. So that's been working very well. And I think I have a specific question. Hi, Sarah. Oh my goodness. Well, yes, Sarah, I can talk about the process for getting ACH payments from finance into Razor's Edge. I have to tell you that,
the larger issue is just around like digital payments and stuff, right? And even like things, the way you can receive donations is changing day to day, right?
It is changing.
Crypto donations, I'm sure.
Right. I can't even think about that right now. What I can say, Sarah, is that right now this is a process in full transparency that I'm trying to revisit because it's taking a little longer than I would like. But basically, we'll get if it's an online donation that comes through our website. We'll first go through Raised Edge to development, then to finance. Then we put it in Razor's Edge again, and then we give it back to finance. So it takes a very long time. If it's like an EFT that goes via wire directly to our bank account, that goes from the finance department to my department. But again, just in describing it there's a lot of extra steps. So I have to say right now, this is something that I'm working to update as we speak. So hopefully if Dave brings me back and I present again next year, I will have a 6 story to share
we'll
with
ask,
you.
we're going to want an update on how the ACH payments are going. I think
Absolutely.
the question, it really does highlight like some of the day-to-day challenges like that fundraisers are constantly dealing with. Chandler, you're muted now.
Ashley, I love that you mentioned the personal phone call. I can't say enough about that. And I know that we're talking about the challenges, but just not to make this a total downer conversation, there are also tremendous opportunities. And I think, Ashley, you touched on one, like that individual phone call with a donor where you're not calling to ask them for anything, you're just calling to say thank you. It can change the tenor of the whole relationship. We did a variation on. It's totally true. And it's fun too, because then you connect individually, you understand what their passions are, and then you can kind of keep them in the loop about certain things that they're curious about. We did a twist on that. This was a national organization. And whenever any of our executives were traveling to another city, we were in DC, say they had a meeting in LA or Chicago or something. When we had enough time, we would let the development team know that that trip was coming up and say, why don't you pull a list of all of our donors in this geographic area? And we're going to be at the so-and-so coffee shop from 2 to 4 on Thursday, and invite any donor that wants to come by for a little meet and greet with our CEO. It was super easy to organize, and the development team would kind of get an RSVP of list of who was coming and supply that executive with a little bit of information on each of the donors that were there, and they got to have that face-to-face conversation. And so many of those little interactions prompted the donor to become more invested and involved, because now they have a personal dynamic with the CEO and increase their gifts. For groups that are local, I've seen groups do like a quarterly, coffee chat with the CEO at the office, like from 5 to 7 one day, just to kind of let them do a kind of update on what's going on, and they could drop by and listen. I think finding opportunities for those personal interactions, apart from just the let us send you this letter for your tax returns, can be really powerful.
Right.
Just
I wrote that down.
I think your microphone's brushing your lapel or something.
Okay.
There's a tapping sound. Thank you for all that. We have some recommendations that I'm excited to hear folks talk about, and we're at the halfway point here. But real quickly here at the end, we'll talk about tracking impact and reporting, which has been, for my nonprofit career, all the rage, right? Metrics and impact and stuff. And in fact, there are entire consultancy firms you can hire, right, to help you. You pay them a lot of money. They will help you track your impact using like numbers and data and all that sort of thing, right? There's also, as we talked about earlier, like storytelling is a way of, right, explaining your impact, right, in a more qualitative fashion.
And there's a lot to say. Did you want to go into compliance, Dave?
Yeah, I mean they are somewhat similar. And
okay.
Let's talk about some of the realities of it. We were discussing it earlier with the public support test from the IRS. And if you're going to receive a large grant from any foundation, that test will be a reality for you. And it's complicated, very complicated. It was set up to thwart very savvy tax scammers. So it is a very sophisticated regulation, right? And lots of the times, the nonprofit folks filling out these forms, right, they're very good at providing services to the public, but not necessarily filling out tax forms. At large organizations, you have a lot. You've mentioned already, finance team that understands fundraising, right? That understands fundraising is important. Not every accountant knows about the public support test. They not necessarily had to deal with it. So just, I'd love, as we wrap up the challenges, maybe sort of mix compliance and metrics together, right? And they are related. These are after the fact gifts. Before we do that, I'll make one quick point, just for me, is that acknowledgement, one benefit is that it can help with burnout. I'm never less burned out than when I am thanking someone for their help, right? And something has to do, like, this is someone who obviously appreciates your work, right? Which is, Ashley was talking about, feeling unappreciated hurts. Like, this person obviously does. You're thanking them, right? You're really flipping the script on that whole unappreciated thing. Thank you very much. I'm going to make a list, and next week I'm going to call some folks. But for now, Ashley, talk to us about the compliance and the tracking impact on the reporting side of things.
Okay, I'll do okay. So on the compliance side, I think that it's becoming, depending on what field you work in, it's becoming just increasingly burdensome and difficult. I would say that, one of the not uncommon things that you might have to think about are the actual prices of some of the grants that you might be able to bring in. There have been times throughout my career where we had to think about refusing a grant, or where we would have been better off refusing a grant, because reporting requirements were so strict and required so much staff time that at the end in order to be compliant, it would have made it not worth it. We would have lost money on that donation. So that's something that, you might not want to do, but I'm sure there's others on the call who've been in that same position or who wish they had refused a gift. So that's something that I think we need to pay more attention to. As far as some of the other compliance issues, there's just so many. I would say that it's always a good idea to have a good attorney. Even if they're not somebody who is on the payroll, make friends with a good attorney, make friends with a good accountant, so that for these kind of questions, I mean, a lot of it, you're expected to know, but you might not have that firsthand knowledge. I know I don't. So that's what I'll say, big picture about compliance. And then as far as tracking impact and reporting, that's another really tough one. I think that quite a few times there's a disconnect between what foundations want to see, less so individuals. Individuals are easier to deal with as far as showing the impact of their gift. But I think a lot of foundations are interested in things that, are scalable and replicable. They say all these things and don't understand that it is very, very difficult for the majority of our nonprofits to have that kind of huge impact that they're looking to have on a social problem or whatnot in a certain funding area. And I think that the way to address that is to have a very candid conversation from the beginning about how you can track impact. Yes, especially when the grant is small. But when it's bigger, sometimes the problem just multiplies because they expect more kids to be, or more clients to be served. And I would say that, the way to address that is to start off by really understanding the problem, get a good sense as far as what program staff are already doing to track impact, because you might be surprised. There might be a lot of things that are already being done that can show the impact during the course of a year or whatnot on a client's life or on the issue. And then to the funders, not to get too far ahead, but to the funders that really want massive impact on a client's life, or to know what the big long-term impact of your organization is, they would need to give millions of dollars in a longitudinal study for the organization to be able to tell them that. And then I'm sure you could, or to arrange for some kind of very close partnership with a research university, again, going over the course of years and years and years. Otherwise, I think it's fundamentally unrealistic. We know that they don't want to see their money wasted, but I think that there needs to be a lot more flexibility here.
Ashley, I would totally agree with that. And just to add one comment and this sort of combo of compliance and impact tracking and reporting, for years at First Book, we gave books to children from low-income families, and I would spend hours with funders who were asking about how, distributing X number of books to a child over a period of Y years
Right.
would increase their reading scores on standardized tests, which was hard enough to talk about because we all know that the resources are just one facet in a constellation of influences on this child's life, from their home environment to their after school environment to their school environment. And then there would be people that would say, well, let's talk about how my gift will change high school graduation rates. And my God, so after about a decade of building this series of data points to make because I do believe that the work that we were doing was helping both of those things, but it's incredibly
sure.
to prove that. So we actually sat down and sort of dramatically re-envisioned how we would define our own work and how we would define our own impact yardsticks for ourselves instead of having someone else define those for us. And that was transformative. So I would urge people, it was so liberating, because we basically realized like what we're about is access. We want kids to have access to books and resources. We want them to have access to, diverse and inclusive resources in which they can see themselves. And it was much easier to measure that. We could count the number of books in the classroom before, and we could count the number of books in the classroom after. We could count the diverse characters in the books before and the diverse characters in the books after. And so I'm just saying, like not everyone's going to do that exact same thing, but if there is a way to step back and reimagine how you're defining impact, and then to educate your funders about how you actually define that impact and how their gift is going to advance impact vis-a-vis your own yardstick, I think you do have an opportunity to change the conversation and to shed a lot of the inefficiencies that are sort of inherent in that earlier system.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think you're right, Chandler. And I do think that there's more flexibility now, with COVID than there ever was before. I've seen some foundations start to go back to being a little bit more rigid. So I'm not sure if that, that door is closing a little bit, but I do think that this is a really good time. And I think you're right. I think it's really just about taking the time internally, as you said, to redefine impact. And there is some real room there, more than I've ever seen.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a great segue into our 5 recommendations. David Jaffe, if you're still listening, we can go on to the next slide, please. That he is listening. So we put our heads together. Collectively, we have over 60 years of nonprofit experience. But baby faces still, all 3 of us. And we came up with 5 not particularly innovative or sexy suggestions. These aren't groundbreaking. These are probably suggestions that other people have made to funders. But nonetheless, I think these are 5 things that we like. And we see both sides of them. Our funders, we're talking later in the administration of generosity panel, we're going to have them talk about these things as well. But let's go through them now. And Sarah seems to like number 1. And certainly this is one where we're not the first people to be like, you should make multi-year general operating grants. I'll start off quickly by saying the counter to this, right? Funders have limited funds as well. The more of these you give, the fewer new organizations you can fund, right? Because you'll have a lot of long-term commitments, right? Which will mean more reporting, right? Requirements for your grantees and other administrative costs and things. So it's not like there's reasons why every funder doesn't go out and make a bunch of. We've also mentioned it a few times already that there's a big staff retention problem. And that complicates things
Huge.
to give multi-year grants when they know statistically none of the people who work there are going to be there at the conclusion of this grant. Ironically, like these are the very grants that could help solve that problem, right? But it's a like wheel before the. And obviously there's lots that you can talk about strategies for achieving them, right? Fundamentally, there's no like the strategy is to find a funder that offers them and apply for it. Right? You're probably not going to cheat. You, the fundraiser, aren't going to change a funder's mind on this. But for funders who are looking for recommendations on like how to alleviate some of these challenges for us, this is, I mean, Sarah has written yes in all caps in the chat here, and she put exclamation points after it too. And we put it number one. We figured, right, that this would be pretty non-controversial. Sorry if you were expecting us to like come out, just like expecting me to come out with a bunch of like gut punches to big philanthropy. And there are a lot of folks who are starting to think about this. But a lot of the new things I've seen are like challenges, challenge-based, prize philanthropy, right? Even giving circles. Giving circles meet regularly and give out grants. They're probably not going to give out 5-10 years. A giving circle is probably not going to give a grant. Just 10 years of general operating. Maybe there are giving circles like that. I'd like to meet them. But what do we think, Chandler? What do you think about multi-year general operating grants?
Well, I love them. So much to say here. Just to be concise, I mean, from my years in the trenches, I know that general operating support is the most critical funding that we raised, and it was the hardest funding to get. So, you know, just to put a big underline under that.
Yep.
And here, I frankly look to the private sector. I feel like, you know, venture capitalists, private equity firms, investment banks, they do a ton of due diligence, specifically on the leadership teams that they're going to invest in. They choose leadership teams that they're really excited about, that they're really confident about, and then they invest and trust them to know their work better than the funder does and go forth, you know. And I think that there are analogous opportunities in the social sector with the folks that I work with advising on philanthropy gifts. We have shifted to sort of less reporting and less stuff after the grant is made, stuff being a super technical term, and more due diligence and conversations with the leadership teams up front, so that the funders get really comfortable and excited about those leaders and their visions and their philosophies, so that they feel comfortable kind of stepping away from a more specific, more restricted gift, and to trusting that leader to lead the organization. Obviously, we do restricted gifts as well, but there are also ways to make those gifts more flexible and more user-friendly for the grantees. Could say lots more, but I'll leave it at that for now. Ashley, what's your take?
Yeah, I think Chandler, you know, pretty much covered it. I would also say that over the past few years with COVID, one of the very good things has been that there has been a transition to much more unrestricted support. It seems like a lot of funders are actually sticking with that. So that's a good thing. I think, you know, in a way, it almost feels like a matter of trust. You know, if you're going to support us, then support us. Let us decide how it needs to be spent. And there is a lot, as you said, a lot of due diligence that can be done. You know, there's this obsession with keeping overhead so low, or, you know, knowing what your fundraising costs are, that sort of thing. That information can still be shared, and we can still have unrestricted support. And I do see the risks relative to multi-year unrestricted. I think that that could be dealt with easily with, you know, the right grant contract. There can still be certain goals that the nonprofit has to achieve in order for the funder to renew its support for the next year. You know, yes, it's a 5-year grant, but you'll get the following years if this, and this. And that could even address some of the concern about staff, because I do think that the high staff turnover is not, it doesn't show any sign of getting better.
No, it's been pretty much the same situation. Been talking to me about that problem since I first started working at nonprofits. One of the ways I think you can sort of help manage the risk of giving a lot of multi-year general operating grants is accepting proposals. There are funders that make their own decisions behind the scenes, so to speak. And in general, what that means is that the programs with that are marketed the best will receive that funding. The larger social media and the best.
Right.
Some of these programs do great work, but ultimately, sector-wide, we probably don't want the majority of the funding to go to only the groups that are best marketed. Right? I know very few people who are like, no, that they should win all of the funding. Obviously, right, with like a grant from Coca-Cola, that's part of why they're giving them a grant. This is a well-marketed program we're supporting that'll help, right, raise goodwill, right? That's an important part of the fundraiser's consideration. And I think there's lots of different considerations funders have. There's lots of different ways to think, right? And there's lots of different ways to accept proposals. Some ways, in fact, Unfunded List can work with you on your grant making program to help you accept proposals more thoughtfully. Happy to provide feedback to all of your applicants. They generally really want it. We were talking about this in the earlier session. Ashley, someone who writes proposals, just to be clear, you want the opportunity to write them. Yes?
Yes, of course.
I've heard from funders that say that nonprofits don't want to waste their time writing proposals. They want to get to work.
No, no.
Well,
You always want the opportunity.
That's the argument for only looking at your website and social media and all that, right? Like, let you do the work, and then they'll make the and like some very notable funders, right? This is how they operate. And to be clear on this specific suggestion, I'm saying there should be some way for people like Ashley who want to send a proposal to you to send it. You can put some thought into that, right, and ask specific questions, and you can even have character limits if you want. I kind of am a fan of character limits. Right? Or you can work with another foundation, right? Help fund, right? Provide support funding to their grantees, right? Review their proposals after the fact. There's lots of ways one can accept proposals thoughtfully. What's a thoughtful way of accepting proposals?
One thing I would say.
Well, one thing that I like,
Did you bring thought in, folks?
I was going to say I found it personally to always be best to be open to having a conversation with the potential grantee first. I like to call foundations before we submit a proposal, and I think that the more that a funder can make themselves reasonably open to that, I know that they're inundated with requests, they're flooded. But it does save everybody time, because there's also plenty of times that I've done that 5-minute phone call and been told, no, don't waste your time, and save probably, hours and hours and hours of work, because we're really not a fit. So I think that having that screening call is a good way.
I think a big part of thoughtful is figuring out how many proposals and requests you can handle, and then designing a program that will get that many requests.
I completely agree. I think another way that you could do that, if you can't do individual calls, I've seen groups do a Zoom or something like this where they answer questions from anyone who has a question. I also personally like phased proposals or rounds. I think that folks designing these grant proposals should understand that nonprofits spend a ton of time filling them out. And I think some people writing the proposals think more questions is better. Let's just throw a lot in. I would urge you not to do that. I think, a first round, it might be your audited financial statements and 2 or 3 questions that get to the core of what you're wanting to fund. The nonprofits applicants can answer those 2 or 3 questions with a word count, forcing them to be concise. And then the funders can review those and politely decline those that they don't think are a good fit, and then ask those that they're really excited about to submit sort of a longer, more in-depth follow-up. I feel like that is much more efficient for the, maybe 80% of nonprofits who aren't going to move to the next round, to save them time. And then I think the feedback at the end, whenever possible, is hugely helpful. I think folks feel bad about saying to a nonprofit, here's why you don't fit. It's actually incredibly helpful to know that information in their own work going forward with other groups.
It can be difficult, though. I mean, I've done
Absolutely
explanation calls, and like their job is to get that funding, and they'll try to talk you out of it as you're there. You think you're there to explain why they didn't get it. They think they're there to get it. These can be difficult. That's why I do like we independently give feedback. I'm not the one we've reviewed their proposals here, but I haven't rejected it. And I think that does make those conversations more helpful because they're not trying to nothing to argue with me about. This is going as well as I'd hoped. Thank you everybody for joining us. If you joined us late, this is Nonprofit Nuts and Bolts. Not my most inspired panel name, but we are talking about the day-to-day work of nonprofits. Currently in the middle of making some recommendations to grant makers. We've talked about this one a little bit, and I do think if you're a very good grant maker, then you probably have some staff, and we're going to hear from some professional grant makers later, right? And those staff are managing relationships with their grantees, right? Like in a pandemic, calls them, talks to them about what they need, maybe turns the restricted grant into general operating once you find out that there's been a crisis, right? That's an example of good responsive philanthropy to me that comes from managing relationships. Also, being clear on expectations, right? What the amounts of grants are and how much funding is available and what the programs are, right? So people can plan accordingly, right? And or if simply telling them bluntly that they are not a fit, right? Can be quite time saving. Many organizations choose as a sort of standard to just not respond to the people they choose not to fund. Like it'll say in the RFP, we don't have time, right, to follow up with everybody, right? You're only going to get boilerplate. And that's because they know they've been thoughtful with their process. They know they won't have the time for it. But you've all got a lot of experience managing expectations with funders. We don't have to do a whole deep dive into how to do that now, but just talk a little bit about it for folks that might just be getting into it or who've been doing it a while, right? How important that relationship management aspect is.
It's really important. I mean, and I've gotten better at it. I wasn't always very good at it because my natural tendency, and I think that's kind of because of how the grantee funder relationship is, there's a power disconnect. So I always want to be able to say, oh yeah, we're going to do that and more. That's no problem. That's, exactly what we do. No, everything's great. And I had to get better because I was only setting myself and the organization up for more stress later on. So this was a hard lesson for me. I think that the other thing around managing the expectations is also working very closely with program staff for restricted grants or any grants in particular. That can make for sort of an easier relationship there as well. And also remembering that when there seems to be something that could cause a grant to go sideways, right? You're not necessarily, as soon as you see you might not be reporting as sunny a picture as you had originally hoped, reel them together, come up with a good strategy to share with the funder and let them know. Don't let it be a surprise when it's time to report or for a renewal, because then you could impact the renewal funding and then you're really in trouble. So I think that part of managing, I guess, the relationship is having communication outside of just the solicitation reporting cycle. Be ready to reach out whenever you feel that there's something that's really important, whether it's good or bad.
Ashley, I couldn't agree more. I think I'll just double click on two things you said. One, I think it's essential to have the funder, the development team, and the program team all crystal clear on what the success metrics are and how that reporting is going to happen. I know at First Book, for example, and I can't remember the specifics, but something like it was really easy for our program team to pull a report on the number of books that a grant recipient had gotten in a certain time period, but it was really, really hard for them to pull a title list of the books that the kids had got in a certain time period. And the program team knew that, but the development team didn't understand that. And the development team was selling pitching a partnership that would have that reporting metric, which was 10x harder for the program team to pull. Whereas the funder was indifferent as to if it was a title list or a whatever list. So
Yeah,
so getting alignment there, and then to say to the program team, look, 2 times a year we're going to need to pull a report with X and Y, and then say, oh gosh, no, make it Y and Z instead of X and Y, and coordinate that with the funder. I think also I completely agree actually that there is a power dynamic disparity typically, and it's really hard for the nonprofit to share the things that aren't going well. And so I always look to the funder. It's a lot easier if the funder creates the space for that conversation in these regular check-ins to say something like, wow, thanks for telling me all the things that are going great. Tell me what your biggest headache is. Tell me what your biggest challenge is. Tell me what keeps you up at night. And if you can create an honest dynamic where you can actually tell those things to a funder, I've seen amazing things happen, because sometimes the funder's like, oh God, I didn't have any idea you were struggling with that. We have another grantee that is excellent at that. Let me put you together. Or maybe they give you a follow-up for something there. So I think if you can create that dynamic of candid exchange, and I look to the fund, it's easier for the funder to create that space. The relationship can really go to the next level.
So on the
right,
point,
yeah, absolutely.
To our next point about advocacy, you're right. Funders it's a power dynamic. They're powerful people. Right. The one thing funders have in common is they've got extra money to give away. It's like makes it so that people will listen to what you have to say generally, and that includes government officials and others. Right. Like sometimes the very specifics of your funding might preclude lobbying or advocacy work, but if you really care about an issue, right, you should probably also be talking to your elected officials. That's what we're talking about. And there may be forms of advocacy that you can engage in. Also, very specifically, right, if you're at a foundation or a trust or some sort of managed fund like that, there are groups and associations that do have lobbying days that do go down, and they are the ones that write tax policy, which we've referred to several times today. The people who actually have to fill out these forms, we can complain about it until we're blue in the face, and that's not going to change. That's probably not going to change these laws. But like they often are clearly written by funders, like just as the regulations are in some other industries. So if you're interested in seeing philanthropy get more inclusive, include more people, seeing some real change happening on some of these issues, right? There are ways that funders can be using their voice, right? And also just to be simple, like if it's education, right? They should be advocating for education in some way with their voice, right? Or if they're funding climate change, obviously there can be choices they make there. We'll hear some more about how some of our funders have, in fact, engaged in some of that stuff. My general experience throughout my career has been that they have been reticent to do so. Have you folks felt the same, or have your funders, have they been vocal advocates for you in addition to the funding?
Yeah, I think that actually on in New York, yeah, I think that on a number of things. For example, changing some of the city contracts so that there were higher reimbursement rates. A lot of funders helped with that. And sometimes on policy issues as well, specific policy issues of concern. Yeah. Not across the board, but I think that, yeah, definitely.
And I think too, there are things that funders can do, obviously in the government law changing context, a ton of things. But there are also other things, there were times when like our chief technology officer left and I was functioning in that capacity, which is a nightmare for all concerned. And reached out to some board members and said, look, here's the predicament that we're in. And there were a few board members in the tech space that could make connections or introductions to folks at big firms that I would not be able to get a hold of if I just called out of the blue. So I think that sort of Rolodex, to use a dated term, that these funders have with the ability to connect, from a subject area expertise capacity or other things in that category. Those introductions don't cost anything, but they can be incredibly valuable to a nonprofit from the bottom line perspective.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Very good. And our last recommendation, right? We were talking about metrics earlier. I really liked, Chandler, your comment, and Ashley alluded to, like, if you work at the nonprofit, especially you're like the founder or been working there for a long time, like, what the impact is, right? And one thing I've seen a lot of is folks that are chasing after these like narrow metrics, right? I've seen a lot of like very clunky language. It was clearly just trying to get like right specifically into this thing. If you need to do that, if you need to make it clunky, then you're probably not a fit for that funder. They're probably going to see it in the language, right? You should be really looking for stuff that, right, if they're being clear about the metrics they look for, there should be metrics that you're looking for. The other thing is it's true. I think I really like what you said, Chandler. Sometimes they are indifferent about the specifics, right? They just they'd like to see some sort of quantified metric, but it doesn't have to be this one or that one or whatever. So you should pick some good ones, right? There's what did I used to call it? I just sort of called it the lead BS metric. Almost every nonprofit has one. It's pretty meaningless. I was at an education organization, and we used to say that 100% of our graduates were accepted to college, which was like a really bogus term because it was like first of all, what about the ones that didn't graduate? And it's like the immediate question that begs. But also, like, we were in DC and we did make them all apply to UDC, which just accepts everybody. So that's why but our funders loved it. They loved it. We had 100%. 100% of our graduates were accepted to college. Amazing. Right? We had other good ones that we were, real impact, real ways that we could tell that impact. That one was a little bit quick, and wouldn't have been my choice. Right? A lot of at Unfunded list, a lot of people want to hear about like how much we've raised for the proposals, right? Which is part of what we do, and I'm happy to say it. But like when I'm telling my own story, we talk about like we've given feedback to these folks who were hearing it, or that we were the first people to review this proposal for folks that were banging their heads against the wall. Right? It's not necessarily about it's nice to hear about the big grants that we get for folks, which we do. But even the people who don't get big grants in our program really appreciate what's happening. Everybody really appreciates what's happening, which is why main reason we continue to do it. We have gone over an hour. Thank you very much. If there are questions, folks should feel free to hand raise or chat things in. I know we had a few during the round. While you folks thoughtfully think up some questions, right? Or maybe we were comprehensive and don't have any. But for now, let's starting with Chandler, some closing remarks on today. Just to as someone who's been working at the nonprofit sector, what do you want people to know about us? What are our lives like?
I mean, I do think it's the sort of best of times, worst of times analogy is true. I mean, I'm tremendously lucky to have done such meaningful work for such a long time, but I have a lot more gray hair and a lot more stress and anxiety than I thought that work would bring. But I think for funders and for people running these groups, I think my aha moment, a few of these comments, around sort of stepping back and thinking about how to find impact in your own terms, stepping back to think about what on the list of things that you've always done can you stop doing, stepping back to imagine, a path for professional development for younger team members. All of that is sort of around like centering your own vision informed by those that you're serving and working with, and sort of going after that boldly, and things that other people think should be wrapped up in that you don't agree should be wrapped up in that, having the freedom to say, this is our vision, this is our model, this is our process, this is why we focus on these things. We found some real step changes in effectiveness from kind of trusting ourselves to make our own decisions, even when the experts might have had a different yardstick. So I would encourage folks to be bold and to trust yourselves and your vision, and to construct your organization to maximize that vision. And that's a liberating and fun process.
Indeed. David Javick, can we get
Wow.
the final slide with some, I think there's our speakers have some time. Oh, Contact. I forgot to update this slide. Send the contact info out. Or you could
Get
my
ahead of them. Yeah.
email. I'll share it. If you folks want to share it in the chat there. These are great folks to know. They've been terrific volunteers to Unfunded List and great panelists today. Thank you very much for coming. I think we were nice and thorough about everything. And I look forward to our next panel. We have some funders who are in charge. Their day-to-day involves considerable grant-making portfolios. They have to read these. They are the ones doing the thoughtful proposal accepting, right? We'll hear from them about some of these challenges and some of those recommendations and what their jobs are like.
Ashley, we need to hear your final thoughts.
Yes, and we'll
Oh, okay.
the closing remarks for this session come from Ashley.
Okay, no problem. I think that, my closing thoughts right now, my concerns are very much around the staffing. And I think that that's one thing that it's really, really critical that funders provide, some insight into and some help with, because I think that burnout will only get worse if this understaffing continues. And that's just my biggest thought right now. That's my biggest concern. But I guess the flip side of that is that for anybody who is currently in the field and is looking to advance or make a career change, this is probably the best possible time because it really is an employee's market.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think you can be. I was looking for a job at nonprofits at like the worst possible time, like to 2006 one time, like when there was literally like no unemployment at all. And one, like the jobs were all very exploitative, right? It was like 28K to like do everything, right? And I was losing out on those jobs to like much more talented professionals, right? And I think it's these days everybody's looking for talented. Every nonprofit would like talented support, and a lot of really cool ones have gotten some new big, large general operating grants, and many of them are hiring now. A really great way to keep up your professional development is to review proposals with Unfunded List. If you want to join us, there's still some time. I'm happy to assign you some proposals. The rest of you, I've been enjoying reading your reviews come in. And hopefully learning about the day-to-day challenges that nonprofit folks face will make you all better reviewers. Thank you again, David Jaffe. Speaking of great staff support, David Jaffe put in the contact info there, right into the slide while we were talking. Look at that.
Oh, excellent.
Top notch.
David.
This is top notch work. And I believe he even did it in like one of our official colors, like all the style guide. Thank you again, David Jaffe, and everybody else for coming and listening, and for our panelists. This has been a great conversation. Look, I'm sure I'll talk about all these topics and more with you. Thanks for your reviews. If you got a proposal, please send us one next round. Maybe you'll hear from Chandler and Ashley. They are terrific evaluators. Thank you very much for that. We'll be back in a little over an hour and a half with our final panel, the Administration of Generosity, with Christina and Ann.